Welcome back. Are we already in episode 6? Um, the topic that I have picked for today is energy minimization and the principles of Aikido. Aikido is a Japanese martial art, considered a traditional Japanese martial art, but one of the youngest of the traditional Japanese martial arts. If I recall correctly, Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, known to Aikidoists as O-sensei, the great teacher, I think it was very early 20th century, maybe 1915, 1920, something like that. There were there have been many iterations, versions of Aikido, including from O-sensei, the founder. So I guess we should probably start with a little bit of the historicity of Aikido. Dramatic oversimplification. If this is interesting to you, there's, I'm sure, many much better resources. Um, but as I understand it, O-sensei was a really was a really runty kid. He was really small for his age. He was much smaller than all the other kids, much weaker than all the other kids. And if I recall correct, he was like bullied, and he had sort of an absent home life. And so I think his parents, or maybe I think at some point he may have run away or something. But anyways, he went to this dojo to train jujitsu, um, and I think the head of the dojo was sort of like skeptical of this runty kid, but he showed a little bit of promise. And this guy realized, his sensei realized, like, this really isn't the dojo for you, because, like, you're good, you're talented, but all of our techniques are based on certain dynamics, and you have different dynamics because of your size and strength and stuff. But I know this other teacher, this other school, and he teaches your kind of martial arts. He teaches, more of a, what we would consider to be sort of a judo type, using the other person's sort of energy rather than using your own strength. So that was, I think, sort of the beginning of Aikido. Was he started training in this dojo where things were the the framework of that dojo's interaction with the opponent. The way they framed it was, we want to use our smallness and our weakness to our advantage. So how can we do that? And so I think that is like laid down the first level for Aikido. Another really interesting thing about O-sensei was that he was a very spiritual person. He was, I think Shinto was the religion, but he was a sort of a Shinto mystic. So he did a lot of sort of spiritual practices, and I think a big part of why he separated from the line of jujitsu that he was then trained in, and why he turned it into Aikido, is in large part due to some sort of integration with the spiritual. Like the physical martial art and the spiritual esoteric stuff he was learning, he was, I think, kind of constantly trying to integrate them. And so essentially this art that he was training in, I don't know, I think there's some idea that it was a Daito-ryu Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, but regardless, his realization was, the principle, the framework that we're operating under is, in order to access power, especially as a smaller, weaker individual, I need to have complete control of this individual. If I start trying to trade blows with them, I'm always going to lose. So first I need to get complete control of them and their body. Then I can start, using that advantage in order to deal damage without giving my opponent the opportunity to return that. So I'm sort of thinking of this from like a video game, like a fighting game perspective of like, I don't want to just commit to an attack that my opponent's going to punish. I need to develop such a significant, gap, such a significant lead, that I'm able to deal some damage without without getting punished, to deal the damage safely. And the way that this martial art achieved that was through a relationship with, of course, your own, but your opponent, what we in Aikido would now call your partner's balance. So by controlling your opponent's balance, basically balance being the principle that allows a person to use their body, right? If you don't have your balance, you can't stand up, let alone walk around, let alone choose where you're going to be, let alone, start throwing punches. Just briefly, like, if you think about, imagine a martial artist throwing a punch in your mind, and imagine what that looks like. I wonder if most people have the same image that I have in my mind as a martial artist. So in my mind, if I'm throwing a punch forward, there must be a line that transmits force. Like, in order to, if you imagine like throwing a punch or trying to do something, or run or jump or something on like an ice skating rink without, skates or anything, you're just going to slip. Without friction, without something to push against, you can't accelerate yourself forwards. And in the same way, if I want to throw something, I'm going to experience an equal and opposite force in the opposite direction. So I need to ground myself. I need to connect somehow to the ground. And this is, I think one of the things that you do when you learn, how to punch, for example, let's say, is that you'll be told, well, you're not really punching with your arm. You're really, punching with your hips or something. But I think it's really important to understand that any time I want not to behave as though I'm on an ice skating rink, which means if I'm on an ice skating rink and you're on an ice skating rink and we're 10 feet away from each other and there's absolutely no friction. Now, keep in mind, ice skating rinks, there's still a significant amount of friction. But if we imagined a perfectly frictionless surface, neither one of us would ever be able to just get to the other person, even though we might just be a few feet apart. We have nothing to push against, nothing to... You could imagine like floating in space, right? If I'm floating in space and you're floating in space, I have to eject some material backwards just to get towards you. And so until I have some friction, something to push against, I can't even punch you. I mean, I can put my hand in front of my body, but I can't actually, move, for one, but also actually deliver any significant force without pushing against something. So all force, all martial force comes from the ground because, there could be something else you're pushing against, but assuming, we're standing up or something, it's the ground is the only thing you can really push against in order to generate force. So when I imagine a martial artist punching, I imagine very clearly the vector between usually their back leg that they're pushing and digging into the ground, which is then giving them a sort of a channel to direct energy forwards in a sort of a punch. So why was I talking about this? Sensei and the history of... So, what O-sensei's source martial art, what the Daito-ryu that he was studying at the time, innovate... Well, I don't know that they innovated, but their system was based on this idea that everything, literally the ability to stand up, the ability to move, the ability to attack and deliver force on a target, all of these things are predicated on a well-defined connection to the ground, which we might call, balance. So they use their balance and the changing and shifting of their balance in order to move, in order to deliver force, in order to attack, in order to do everything. So if I can understand the balance system, if I can intercede, if I can get in there and influence, maybe very dramatically, maybe top down, maybe very subtly, maybe only through psychological means, but if I can somehow disrupt their balance system, they lose the ability to attack me. They lose the ability to resist me. They lose the ability to move where they want to move. They lose the ability to stand up and maintain their structure in an organized way. So this preeminence, or this fundamental principle of balance as being the basis for all other sort of martial... why do I start a sentence without knowing what I'm saying? All sort of martial organization, I don't know. all sort of martial form is predicated on some fundamental balance. There's a story I saw only a few months ago of this Aikidoist. I think he was telling a story about he had a teacher who was, constantly drilling balance, 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 balance. Everything's about balance. And then one day he was teaching, he was like walking across the mat to or from a demonstration or something. And as he was walking, the tip of his big toe sort of lined up with the edge between two mats. And as he stepped and his weight transferred, it pressed the mat he was stepping on just low enough that when he went to take his next step, his toe sort of caught on the edge of the next mat. And he sort of stumbled, he fumbled for a second and then regained his balance, and sort of, a little bit of embarrassing moment as a teacher, especially as an Aikidoist talking about balance, and then you trip over a mat. It's kind of, and he just like stopped and he turned to the class and he said like, I'm a master of balance. I've been doing this for 50 years. And all that was required to turn me into, a stumbling toddler, a drunkard, to completely lose my footing was just one little catch, not even a big thing, just a little bit of a delay in a certain part of the balancing process, just this tiny little interruption, and I'm immediately falling apart. And I think this illustrates the fundamental preeminence, let's say, of balance, is that it doesn't matter how terrifying, how scary, how whatever, you could be a Goliath, so to speak. But the moment your balance goes, you just become a sack of rocks. Like you just, your system, the whole design, engineering, whatever, maybe those aren't the best words, of like human biomechanics is all predicated on this fundamental architecture of balance. So the epiphany that O-sensei had was, well, wait a minute. If I have access to this dimension where I can completely control my opponent, not yet partner, still an opponent, my opponent is completely at my whim, at my mercy. Well, why then do I have to destroy him? Why do I have to I've already defeated him. I already control him. There's some sense of, well, if I don't permanently injure him, then when I step away and remove my control, then he'll just attack me again. So that's a dimension that Aikido has to deal with. But fundamentally, the innovation of Aikido is, well, if I control them, I don't have to hurt them. So this is, to me, the essence of Aikido. It's by controlling a person's balance, by existing or, focusing on the domain of balance, the domain of conflict doesn't really exist, because conflict is predicated on balance. I have to have my own integrity in order to fight with you. So if I don't have my own integrity, I'm actually not even structurally able to be a threat to you, to attack you. And so, there are perhaps deeper elements of Aikido. One of the elements, whether it's fundamental or whether it emerges, is that in order to affect your balance, it's much harder to affect your balance if I'm in opposition to you. Because, even though this may be a conceptual innovation of Aikido or of O-sensei, all combat is predicated on this. So even if you're not an Aikidoist, even if you're doing whatever, wrestling or karate or jiu-jitsu, whatever you're doing, you exist in this world which is fundamentally based on balance. So all fighting systems, have to account for this, have to reckon with the preeminence of balance. The question is sort of like how, and so I think a lot of like lay people think of martial arts as, striking, causing damage, but actually, especially in jiu-jitsu and stuff, it's all about balance. It's all about structure. It's all about connection to the ground, because that's the fundamental thing. If you don't know about the history of the early UFCs, the Hoisey family, just the first UFC was basically a let's see which martial art is the best, and jiu-jitsu just smoked everyone else because passing, the attacks and getting into grappling, if you know what you're doing, isn't that hard. And once you're grappling, if they don't know how to grapple, if they don't understand how to protect their balance, I mean, you can just... so there's some funny... If you're not familiar with this and you're interested in it, you got to watch those early UFCs. But anyways, all martial arts, reckon with this fundamental problem of balance. If we say that's the first innovation of Aikido is, well, if I have their balance, I don't need to hurt them. Maybe this second, or like the flip side of that is, if that's presupposing that I've gotten their balance, now I don't need to do damage. Sure, that's sort of maybe what a lot of people think of and associate with Aikido. But actually the question is, well, everybody would accept, yeah, if I have total control of the person, I don't need to hurt them. I mean, every martial art would agree with that. I don't think there's many people who would argue with that. I think the true objection from a lot of martial arts is, well, yeah, but how the hell am I going to get total control of somebody's balance? And I think this is maybe the deeper principle of Aikido, or the transformational principle of Aikido, is that actually when you are in opposition to something, when you are attacking or fighting, maybe is a good word, when you are resisting against something, you actually empower it. Well, you empower its structure. So, I mean, you can think of this from a very basic perspective. Is like, I have 2 legs on the ground. Now you and I start grabbing each other and trying to wrestle with each other. Well, now the 2 of us have 4 legs on the ground. So if I, as an individual, need to balance in order to stay upright, my muscles are constantly, if I were to go unconscious, I would fall down because I can't stay standing while unconscious. As 2 people, let's say we're sort of leaning in towards each other as we're sort of wrestling, the base that our feet are forming is sort of a square. We could sort of lean on each other and just sort of be a single unit that is balanced and doesn't require muscular tension in order to maintain. So, there's a sort of an exercise we do where you sit back to back with somebody, hands free, and just by pressing into each other's backs with your feet on the floor, you're able to both stand up using each other as support. And it's a very interesting feeling because of the constraint of pressing against this other person. As long as you're evenly pressing against each other, standing up feels effortless. Not only effortless, but very well controlled. It doesn't feel... There's nothing about it that feels... Like, when you first start doing it and you're not in sync with your partner, you feel totally wobbly and you keep wanting to put your hand down to catch yourself. But when you're actually connected and in sync with your partner, it's just like standing up, maybe like against a wall. But it's even... Because it's like, imagine a wall that's sort of rolling you up, right? Because the other person's standing up too. So it's almost like a wall that's taking 50% of your body weight and helping you stand up. So anyways, this idea that when we resist and fight and oppose each other, we actually strengthen the other person's structure. We give them their balance. If we think about like a classical, Star Wars, but 2 swords clashing, which is so silly, but, 2 people with swords, the swords have clashed, and now they're sort of wrestling with what we would call the jiku point, or the contact point between the swords, and they're sort of like pushing on each other's swords, which I think is a totally silly and unrealistic thing. But when we're in this moment of contest, this tug of war, we're pushing against what they are doing. If we push with all our might, and they push back against us with all their might, and then we, suddenly disappear, we teleport away, they just completely are going to fall into this hole because we were what was holding them up, right? Like, normally you hold yourself up by balancing, but once someone starts pushing on you, they're going to push you over unless you counteract, unless you sort of lean into their push. Now you're stable and balanced again, unless the push disappears, in which case you suddenly fall into that hole. So this is one of the fundamental principles of Aikido. Sensei, I don't know if he wrote it or said it, but in The Art of Peace, one of the, again, it's a translation of some of his collected writings. He wrote, when somebody develops an attack, when somebody commits an attack, I mean, he used maybe more spiritual language, but he said basically they are violating the balance of the universe. And so in initiating an attack, they are already unbalancing themselves. And you return their balance to them by choosing to resist or receive that attack. The moment that you move and account for that attack and choose not to be in opposition to it, not to conflict with it, but instead to encourage it or to support it or to, accompany it, that you immediately sort of reveal to them that what they were doing in the absence of you, if you were a hologram that they mistook for a real person and they tried to punch you, right at the moment of contact where they would have hit you, and now suddenly they're not hitting anything because, it was just light, they immediately fall into the whole of their expectation. Now, it is possible to punch the air in a stable way where you have your support underneath you, but it's very uncommon, because if I'm actually expecting to hit something, then punching in that way would actually disempower my punch. If I want the maximally effective punch, I'm sort of having to overcommit, which is safe only because I expect to make contact. The moment that that target disappears and now I'm punching the air, if I've committed to that, then, I fall in the hole. So I think a great illustration of this is just like watching boxing. Watching, or not even boxing, but like UFC stuff, like watching the way that they throw uncommitted punches, and then watching, these fighters who are like, the Muhammad Ali, the Mike Tyson, whatever, these guys who just bob and weave. I mean, that's Aikido, where you're so close to the attack. It has this very unique look of, because essentially what we're talking about is sort of sympathetic movement, right? You take a step forward, I take a step back. Punch comes towards me, I move just a millimeter out of its range, and then you pull back. Now, if you fully commit to that attack, that little movement out of the way won't be enough, but you're also going to lose your balance. So in order to preserve your balance, you're never going to really fully commit to an attack unless you're absolutely sure that, they're already incapacitated. So this sort of, the different types of attack, a committed attack versus an uncommitted attack, which maybe we could say more technically, an attack in which I have committed that I am going to make contact. I'm operating under the presumption that I'm going to make contact, versus an uncommitted attack, an attack where I'm not necessarily presuming that I'm going to make contact and that I may need to account for the fact that I will miss. These are very different types of attack, but both fit within the category of, although the committed attack more so, that they are taking their own balance. So as an Aikidoist, if my job is to control a person, and to control them I need to have access to their balance, and they give me their balance when they attack me, then all I need to do is be present and accompany the attack. All I need to do is allow their own self-falling, I guess, because their own self-balance they're giving me their balance. All I need to do is be there to receive it in such a way that they can't take it back, right? So I think this is, in some sense, leads to the real powerful element of Aikido, which is that if I oppose you, if I resist, if I'm fearful and self-protective, if I am afraid of the attack, if I react or if in any way I allow ourselves to be agonists of one another, the moment I allow myself to be opposed to you or in conflict with you, then I'm sort of playing your game. We're fighting, and if supposing I'm O Sensei, which I'm also a smaller, not very strong person, but assuming that I'm the O-sensei in the situation and my partner is this, martial giant. Like, the moment I play the game of who's stronger, I just immediately lose. It's, like, not even worth it. So part of the Aiki method is I can't ever allow myself to be opposed, which is, I would argue, is one of the weaknesses of a lot of Aikido in the world, is that a lot of Aikidoists are still in the mindset of, I need to, get all my bag of tricks so that I can defeat my opponent. O-sensei, one of the, there are many criticisms of Aikido, many controversial things, but one of the things that O-sensei said was that Aikido is non-competitive, that you can't use Aikido in competition, which I think is misunderstood, and I feel like I misunderstood it for many, many years, for, the first decade or whatever, more than that. I think a lot of people take that as a mandate of, like, you're not allowed to use Aikido in competition. You can't, win a tournament by using this, as though it was some sort of, like, ethical or spiritual commandment or something. And I think a lot of people criticize Aikido because of that. But I actually don't think that's what he was saying. I don't think it was an edict. I don't think it was a commandment. I think it was a sort of a description. It wasn't a, like, you may not use Aikido competitively. I think it was a true Aikido cannot be used competitively. Because in order for something to be competitive, I have to be trying to win. And so Aikido is a technology that you cannot use to win. Now, asterisk, footnote, you can, obviously, right? If I can gain some advantage by being non-competitive, then I immediately exploit that advantage competitively. I can, over some limited period of time, I can use, for a moment, I can use a non-oppositionalness as an advantage, and then immediately start opposing them again. But I think in, maybe a deeper, in a more spiritual sense, that what O-sensei really was saying is that Aikido is itself a quantity that is non-competitive. So whether you can compartmentalize the non-competitiveness within a larger competitive framework, I don't think that's some sort of limiting case that prevents that from being possible. But I think that's basically what he was saying, is that if you are in the mindset of, I need to beat this person, right now, under these conditions right here, that you limit and constrain yourself. And that Aikido, as a sort of maybe solution to impossible problems, requires those dimensions of freedom. And so if you restrict those dimensions of freedom, you actually can't do Aikido. Getting a little abstract and esoteric here. But I think that's important to think about, is that Aikido is not a traditional martial art in the sense that I'm going to do Aikido techniques on you. Aikido is a framework for handling conflict, which is orthogonal to competition. It exists, maybe like, I don't know, tangentially or something. I don't know. Like, it's not to say that you can't use the principles of, non-conflict or as an effective form of, competitive advantage. I'm sure that you can. But I think that, psychologically there's a huge cost. I mean, there's the physical dimension of Aikido, but there's also the psychological dimension of Aikido, which says, like, if I, it's like learning a second language. It's like I'm saying to myself, oh my gosh, this person is doing something I don't like. Okay, I want to destroy them and control them and dominate them and survive them and, whatever. I want to be victorious here. Oh, well, how will I do that? Well, I'll use my Aikido. Okay, well, if I was using Aikido, if I translate my desires for domination and control into the language of Aikido, well, then I would, get out of the way, and I would redirect, and I'd receive, and whatever. But then once I have their balance, then I'm going to, break their arm, or I'm going to cause pain, or I'm going to, humiliate them, or whatever. So I'm sort of, Aikido is a sort of a secondary language, which we translate from our control and domination-based fundamental internal framework, translate it into Aikido, try to use that to get some effective technique, and then the moment that we have the advantage we want, the moment we're controlling our partner, then we immediately translate back into damage and destruction and control and domination. So I don't want to denigrate that. I don't want to say there's no value to that or something, but I think that that's an intermediary step. I do think there is a direct apprehension of the principles of Aikido where, somebody, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical attack, right? Just somebody just completely, comes at you, unloading. Maybe it's passive aggressive, maybe it's not even verbal, or maybe they just start screaming at you, whatever. There's something, it could be on any sort of dimension, and rather than thinking, oh God, how am I going to protect myself? Well, I'll use the principles of Aikido. Instead of thinking that, you just go right to, oh, here's a thing, I'll be together with it. Oh, attacking me, I wonder what that's about. And there's no initial apprehension or fear or, thing that then triggers the, well, I need to not protect, I need to not resist, I need to somehow combine. It's just a fundamental kind of relationship. It's just like, oh. And to me, the felt experience is like, well, this sucks, right? It's like, you see, like, I don't know, like road rage or like public sort of incidences. Sometimes I'll see them like on YouTube or something. And it's like somebody completely loses their cool. It's like, this thing sucks. This business I'm at, they're dropping the ball here. We're all waiting. I was at a department store waiting in the electronics section, and there were like 12 people. We were waiting for like 30 minutes, and they just didn't, the person there couldn't log in, they couldn't access anybody, they couldn't intercom, they couldn't communicate with the only people who could help, couldn't be contacted. So even the employees were just waiting, like, eventually someone will walk by, and it was just so insane. It was so beyond insane. But, like, there's a million examples of that, where it's like, there's a part of me that wants to explain very clearly, in very clear and simple language, how unconscionable, like, why would you stand here? Go find them. Let's solve this problem. Call them. Let's contact corporate. I mean, do we need to close the store? Like, let's do something. And yet, internally, my monologue, my process is saying, well, the one thing I no matter how ridiculous this is, this thing that I feel is unfair or bad or whatever, this person is attacking me or, whatever I feel, the one thing I'm not going to do is lose control, right? It's like, oh, here's a great example because it's sort of neutral. It's a personal thing. You've decided you need to move a bunch of things from point A to point B, so you stack them up to carry them, and you're carefully carrying this stack of stuff, and something falls, or you bump it, whatever, something happens and it starts to deteriorate. In my mind, I'm thinking, wow, this really sucks. I wish I had remembered that thing was, I wish I hadn't bumped into, I wish the light had been, I wish whatever, I wish things had been different. But the one thing I know I'm not going to do is suddenly react or get upset, because then I'm going to drop everything and everything's going to crash down and everything will be ruined. So no matter how much this sucks that things aren't going well, my only hope is to keep my cool and to, do my best to recover. That's sort of the feeling I have. It's like, the classic Aikido technique is like someone grabbing your wrist. It's like, I don't like this. I don't want this. But I know the worst thing I could possibly do is to try to fight using muscle and try to overpower them. Especially, when I started training, I was a kid and these are adults. So like somebody who's like 10 times stronger than you is grabbing onto you. Well, the one thing I'm not going to do is fight them. Because that's the one way I'm guaranteed to lose, is if I try to contest with this person. So to me, that's sort of it takes a while. It's not even necessarily like the functional principle, but like that's the lesson it teaches you, is like, okay, you want to exist in your little world where you translate between your ultimate desires and the language of Aikido. So you sort of pretend to be an Aikidoist, right? You know about Aikido, so you can sort of intellectually, but when, the chips are down, still your default is to respond aggressively. What Aikido teaches us is like, there's a helplessness. There's a futility in trying to fight against something. And you know what? Maybe it's like a kid who's grabbing you. Maybe you really could just effortlessly overpower them. But there are other there are other costs to that. So the fundamental change that Aikido, at least for me, but I think probably for other people as well, the thing that it transformed in me, the thing that it changed in me is like, the word anguish comes to mind. Is like there's a sort of an anguish that happens, an emotional anguish where the world, experience, a person, whatever, like something has happened which is just so unfair. Like I'm carrying this thing, I bump into whatever, and like maybe I go, oh, my roommate left out this thing. So it wasn't me. I didn't make a mistake carrying too much stuff. But some, person thwarted me by turning the light off so it was dark when I came in and my hands were full so I couldn't turn. Like somehow I identify, this was unfair, this happened to me, this was not within my control. And then this anguish, this like, well, oh, screw it. If 10% of the things are fallen, well then I'm just going to throw the other 90% to the floor. And we have this like very sort of, I don't know if self-destructive is the right word, but it's like, well, because something happened that was unfair, now I have either the right or even some sort of obligation or something to throw a tantrum. And to me, the internal transformation is like, oh, the throwing the tantrum works in the model of I'm a child, and if I throw a tantrum, some bigger, wiser being, my parents, the legal system, the spectators, whatever, someone will ally themselves with my moral victimhood, and they'll say, oh, I'm basically asking for help when I get upset. I'm saying like, this is unfair. Whereas the realization is like, oh, I'm on my own here. Like, it's just me. So if I get upset and throw down this stack of stuff, I'm the one who has to pick it up. I'm the one who has to clean it. I'm the one who has to repair it. I'm the one who has to replace it. So it doesn't matter. I don't know if you've ever had like, some stack of precarious things, like whatever, like marbles or something I'm carrying. I've somehow like pressed my forearm against my belly, and I have like, a couple hundred marbles, and I'm like carrying them somewhere. And then like, whatever, I stumble, and like 90% of them fall. What do? Like, do you maintain? Now you're avoiding stepping on the marbles. Well, like, do you hold it there while, 90% of the stack has just collapsed? Or do you just give up on that last 10%? Like, what happens internally in your monologue? Sometimes, like, something will spill or something, and there's a part of me that's like, get it fast, handle it before it gets out of control. Like, it's now spilling, it's now spreading, so go, get it before it gets worse. There's also a thing where, like, something will fall and break and shatter, And I'll just be like, I don't actually really need to worry about that until I, walk into that room. So I'm just gonna you know, I'm gonna finish what I was doing, and I'll clean that up afterwards. There's sometimes there's a sort of a tug of war where I'm like, oh, I should clean that up now. Just do it later. Yeah, but then I'm going to be tired and I don't want to do that right before. So there's a sort of like an internal negotiation. And to me, Aikido sort of obliterates the negotiation. Not obliterates, that's probably not the best word to use. But Aikido exposes the foolishness of the argumentation of the tug of war. Aikido just says, don't frame it as separate. Don't frame it as a problem, right? It's just a process that you're a part of. The moment it's a process that you're a part of, you are immediately empowered to influence and make changes that you're aligned with. The moment that you frame it as a problem, as other, it's like you want to convince other people that they should solve it. It's like you're asking for help. You're telling a story in such a way that it calls for aid or support or intervention or something from the other. The moment that you take that sort of step for like radical self-responsibility, it's like, yeah, maybe the attack was unfair. Like all attacks are unfair. Maybe this bureaucratic process, this whatever, like something in the world, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a person, maybe it's a natural phenomenon, maybe it's an institution, but like something happened where like I'm being treated really unfairly. Like this is not right, this is not okay, this is not ideal. And it's like, how are you going to relate to that? How can you access your power? The moment that you frame yourself in opposition or outside of or separate from that thing, whether it's you or somebody else or them, you're calling for intervention because you're necessarily outside of it. But the moment that you identify is maybe the right word, but the moment you frame yourself as an element of the process, then you can actually sort of take control from the inside. Like when I talk about controlling someone's balance, now I'm getting a little esoteric, so in terms of like strictly speaking, be generous with me. But I'm not grabbing their balance, I'm not taking their balance. Not that it can't be done, but I'm accepting their balance. They're giving me their balance, and I'm accepting it in a sort of a neutral, but I'm not taking it or grabbing. I'm not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not like, I'm thinking like addicted, or like I'm not compulsed. I'm not interfering with their balance. Maybe that's a good way of thinking. I'm not interfering with their balance. I'm aligning myself with their balance. The interesting thing about like the image of like Muhammad Ali or something, or somebody who's just these totally best in the world punchers just throwing punch, 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 and him just going move, move, dodge, duck, just bobbing and weaving so perfectly. It's like there's no separation. Sympathetic movement, right? I'm so in tune, I'm so aligned with your balance, your weight shift, your movement, that you can't actually reach me. You can't access me because we're not separate. You can't move against me or into me because I'm moving exactly as you are. I've fixed myself to your frame of reference. Like, I'm thinking like there's a sort of like an underwater, when you are trying to like swat a bug or something, there's like a fly, and you like try to like, roll up a piece of paper and whack it or something. Well, if you don't understand what's happening, you don't have good techniques, a lot of the time the fly, you're not going to be successful. And one of the reasons for that is that we imagine like our reality of when somebody, let's say, takes a stick or whatever, baseball bat, and whacks you as hard as they can. no part of you feels the air being accelerated by the baseball bat. That's just not part of our. It's too fast. It's too small. We experience the baseball bat, but a bug, a fly, they experience the pressure wave, the airflow change that precedes the potential contact of this object and themselves. So when you take a piece of paper and go to whack a bug, it's sort of like being in the water and like a big boat coming towards you. As it pushes the water out of the way, the water pushes you out of the way. So unless it's like, a straight, perfect shot, you don't really have to avoid the boat. You just have to be in the water. And as the boat moves the water aside, you are also moved aside in turn. And Aikido very much has that sort of quality to it, where it's like I don't have to be doing anything in a sort of interventionist sense. I just have to know exactly how to structure myself to be, you know, sort of in the appropriate spot in the water where I'll end up in the right spot. So I'm sort of navigating the currents of the water, this intervening medium. I'm not really so much concerned about you. Because as long as I'm in this water, you can't really get to me. There's this buffer, this air buffer between us. So, I don't know that I would even be able to explain this in audio, but in the classic, maybe the most fundamental Aikido technique that I do, at least, this is sort of my take on it, but, one person grabs the other person's wrist and gives them some energy and sort of pushes them. And if you're totally empty and sort of neutral, so I'm maintaining my structure so that I stand up, but I'm not resisting pushing in any sort of way, I'm just sort of basically letting them do whatever they want. The way that they push me matters. If they push me along the vector of the arm, which is off my center line, my body will sort of rotate, right? Depending on which side, where the angle, the vector that they're aligned with, I will either, we could say, like, open and expose the center line of my body more towards them as I'm rotated, or they could close me by pushing on the other side of the center line, sort of causing me to turn my back to them. The only way in which one of those two things doesn't happen is if they somehow manage to push exactly on that center line. Now, obviously, it's not a single impulse, right? They would aim for the center line, and as our bodies and as things happen dynamically, they would adjust that vector, that angle a little bit, so that they're constantly pushing along my center line. And this is one of the bases for traditional Aikido, is that I'm sort of presupposing in the basic techniques that my partner is always directing energy towards my center line. And, the most basic technique, which sometimes is called katatedori tenkan, meaning one-sided wrist grab turning, or taino henko, which means sort of body pivoting. These are different names. One is the technical description within the system of Aikido names, and one of them is sort of a colloquial name. Taino henko is sort of the colloquial name. Tai means body, and henko means to rotate or pivot. So it's like the body's turning. Part of, again, many different versions of this technique, many ways to do it, but one of my fundamental ways of doing this technique is I sort of wait until I feel my partner's pushing along my center line. I feel that connection, and then I move it 1 millimeter to the side. I'm using my muscles now. I'm using my force, and I move. If we think of the vector, like the line between my partner and I like bow the middle of it, right in the center. It's like I just barely tapped it. I just put it ever so slightly off center. Now they, assuming they're sensitive and can feel it, will sort of feel that they're no longer sort of on the center line, and they'll sort of try to correct it a little bit, and that's my window. That's where I sort of maintain the structure and allow them so that as they continue to direct energy towards me, because it's ever so slightly off the line, they then create the rotational movement. So if you're watching this happen, they grabbed my wrist and I turned my body and rotated it to the side and allowed them to pass me. But what is invisible, unless you're very perceptive and know what's happening, is that I'm not originating any of the energy. I'm aligning the structure, but all of the energy, the thing that turns me, is their forward impetus, is their reaching into my center, or they're trying to reach into my center while I'm deflecting them by 1 degree. And that means that even though they're trying to hit my center line, because they're a little bit off, I naturally start to rotate. All I'm doing is maintaining the sort of the integrity, the structural composition of my body. They're the one that is causing this movement to happen, with one slight exception, right? All I'm doing is just being, all they're doing is just pushing, except I'm doing just one little bit extra, which is that 1 degree, that 1 millimeter deflection. So I'm doing almost nothing, and this technique manifests from, maybe I could say like I'm exploiting their attack, but I'm using the energy of their attack, which means also that the moment they stop, right, they go to push on me and they realize that they're missing a little bit and they stop, well, I stop too, because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't going, oh, he's pushing on me, now I'll turn. All I was doing was aligning myself relative to my partner, and they were creating the movement, meaning the moment they stop, my movement stops. The moment they pull away, I return, right? Like all I am is connecting my structure to them in a way that is, advantageous or self-protective. I'm maintaining my integrity. That's all I'm doing. And what the innovation of Aikido is like, I don't really need to do that much more. In addition to maintaining the integrity of my body's structure, the only thing I really need to do in addition to that is these slight, really subtle, invisible, so small you can't really tell they're there, adjustments, so that as they, if I didn't do that, if they really were to get on my center line, then I wouldn't be able to maintain my balance. But the ability to maintain my balance through rotation only requires like an infinitesimal deflection off of the center line. So to me, that's, I've probably said this sentence like 20 times, but that's the magic of Aikido at the core of it, is I can just, I think the problem, one of the difficulties with Aikido is like, at what point do you have enough experience, enough confidence, enough security, self-security, that you can just relax and maintain your own composition in the face of, some vicious attack. Like, that's tough, because everything in your mind is going, oh no, do something, run away, protect yourself, so to just say, oh wow, that's a really vicious attack, you must be upset. To just accompany that and to be with it is daunting. But I think it's daunting from the outside. I think it's daunting when you look at it. But once you're in it, you're like, wow. I mean, I think one of the great examples of this is like if you go to like a traditional, I don't even know if that word applies, but a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu dojo, often just called it like a jiu-jitsu gym or something, and you start rolling with other people, especially like you have a big skill gap, so a much more advanced person going with a much more basic person. If you've been doing it for, even a couple years, but you're against some like top level black belt master, you can try as much as you want. You can throw everything at them for as long as you want until you're dripping with sweat, and they really don't have to do very much to defend themselves. These are just slight structural adjustments, and you're like trying to lift their whole body weight, trying to overcome them, and they're just like, just shift. Like when you're standing around and like you shift from one leg to the other because your leg got tired or something, just kind of like that. They're just like, oh yeah, okay. It's like totally effortless, and they completely thwart everything you're able to do, because they have there's no fear, there's no concern, like, okay, yeah, if he really does something crazy, I might have to do something. But until then, I'm just hanging out. So it's that kind of a feeling, is like I should be so secure, so knowledgeable that it really just takes very subtle adjustments. There's nothing. There's no panic mode triggered, right? There's no sympathetic response. There's no. I've used sympathetic in a different context. I mean, like neurologically sympathetic, as in like an activation arousal response. It's like I'm not even. I mean, I think that's sort of like the pre-Aikido, is like, I think there's is it Mike Tyson in an interview? It was really cool. He was talking about like he knows the outcome of a fight before it begins, because the real fight happens when they walk into the same room and they look at each other. Like there's a sort of a dominance exchange where he's like, I know I've crushed his spirit before the bell rings, before we even begin. I know, and both fighters sort of know, like, we know, we're judging each other's confidence, right? We're just by looking at a person's eyes, you can see what's going on, which is why I think one of the supreme techniques of Aikido is, even though at some level you may be, pooping bricks in fear, that simply by performing a lack of concern, you can sort of disrupt someone's expectation. Like if somebody is trying to upset you, they're trying to terrify you, make you fearful, but you're just completely neutral. You're not responding or reacting at all in the way they expected. That's really unsettling. That can really throw a wrench in their program, their plan. Likely they're going to then ramp up to try and, completely overwhelm you, so that you have no choice but to respond. And I think that's sort of the alchemical gold, the far off promise of Aikido, is at some point, you as the warrior, you look down your own destruction. You stare death in the face, and there's no point, there's no purpose, there's no benefit of fear, there's no benefit of trying to escape. There's no possibility of, it's either I do this and I access 100% of what I can. I'm either totally present, or I will, face destruction. But there's no room for, escape. There's no getting out of this. And I think that's sort of what Aikido is trying to teach me, at least, is, you try to escape from the conditions of your existence at your own peril. Because whenever something unfortunate happens, something unfair, something, whatever, you run from it at your own peril. You will make it worse. You will encourage more attacks. You will become clumsy. You will fumble. You will whatever. The real lasting sort of impression from Aikido is like, you better be ready. You better show up, because you're gonna need. You may need to explore possibilities that you have never even imagined before. You may need to respond in ways and along dimensions that you didn't know existed. So you better be 100% present when you get attacked. Because if you're running away, if you're afraid, if you're, trying to think your way out of it, or, fight your way out of it, you're missing the real structure, the real dynamics of this attack, of this conflict, of whatever that you need to be in. So we are out of time. I was thinking about teasers. One of the things I want to talk about that we didn't really get to is like, how do you transform a system from the inside? I was thinking about words for this, and one of the words, which is like kind of a weird word, but I like the idea of like possession. Like, you've been possessed by a demon or something. Like that there's this spirit or this energy or this, this set of goals and desires, whoopsie, sorry about that. Within a system. So like to walk into a system and then transform it from the inside. Like that's possession, you know? I'm like, I don't know. Anyways, I think maybe that's what we'll talk about next time. We will see. Anyways, it's been an hour. Thank you for joining me. Give me your feedback, questions, comments, all that kind of stuff. And until then, until then, I'll see you next time. Whatever. Bye.